drought-stricken Colorado River is in critical condition. Almost 2 years ago, the federal government declared the first ever shortage on the river.
States will need to come to some sort of an agreement on how much water every state will get from the Colorado River.
The discovery of deep structural cracks in the bed of the Colorado River sent shockwaves through the American Southwest, triggering an immediate and sweeping shutdown of the Colorado River system by U.S. federal authorities. This sudden decision, executed with military precision and nationwide urgency, halted key activities across 7 states that rely heavily on the river's water for agriculture, industry, municipal supply, and hydroelectric power. The Colorado River, long considered the lifeline of the arid West, had never before seen such a decisive intervention. But these newly found cracks, stretching across vital segments of the riverbed, presented risks too great to ignore. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Geologists from the U.S. Geological Survey (USGS) first identified the fissures during a routine drone surveillance sweep near Glen Canyon, upstream of Lake Powell. At first, the anomalies appeared as minor surface deviations, possibly the result of sediment erosion. However, upon further inspection using subsurface imaging and sonar scanning, the cracks were found to extend dozens of feet into the rock below the riverbed. The scale of these disruptions was extraordinary, wider and deeper than anything previously recorded in the region. Within days, the concern escalated from scientific curiosity to a federal emergency. The implications of such geological instability within the riverbed of the Colorado are profound. This is not merely a crack in a stretch of wilderness, it's a rupture within one of the most critical arteries of American infrastructure. The river supplies water to over 40 million people, irrigates nearly 6 million acres of farmland, and supports ecosystems stretching from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf of California. Any compromise to its structural integrity has cascading effects across nearly every sector of life in the American Southwest. What startled federal agencies most was the nature of the cracks themselves. Unlike surface erosion or seasonal shifts, these formations appeared tectonic in origin, potentially signaling deeper seismic activity beneath the region. The Colorado Plateau is not generally considered a high-risk seismic zone, but the presence of such profound fissures raised fears of a previously undetected fault line or subsurface instability. If these cracks were to expand further or trigger collapses within the channel walls, the structural safety of dams like Hoover and Glen Canyon could be jeopardized. Within 48 hours of the findings, the Department of the Interior coordinated with the Bureau of Reclamation, FEMA, and several state-level emergency agencies to initiate a multi-stage shutdown of water flow through key reservoirs. The water release from Glen Canyon Dam was reduced to emergency levels. Lake Mead downstream experienced a sudden drop in input flow, resulting in a temporary halt of hydroelectric generation from Hoover Dam. Agricultural districts in Arizona and California were issued emergency alerts, and canal gates feeding irrigation systems from the Central Arizona Project were closed entirely. The human impact was immediate. Farmers in Southern California's Imperial Valley and Arizona's Yuma region faced the loss of scheduled water deliveries during one of the most critical stages of the growing season. These areas produce vast quantities of winter vegetables for the entire nation. Without access to Colorado River water, their fields would begin to wither in days. Emergency water reserves were mobilized, but these were only enough to sustain high-priority zones for short periods. Municipal water authorities from Denver to Los Angeles scrambled to implement restrictions. In Las Vegas, officials moved quickly to restrict non-essential water usage, closing ornamental fountains, limiting golf course irrigation, and launching public service campaigns urging residents to reduce consumption. The metropolitan areas of Phoenix and Tucson, already strained by record heat, were forced to activate contingency supplies from groundwater reserves. Meanwhile, city planners in Albuquerque, Salt Lake City, and San Diego initiated meetings with federal representatives to request emergency support and updated forecasts. One of the most critical sectors impacted was hydroelectric power. Hoover Dam, which supplies electricity to millions across Nevada, Arizona, and California, faced a sudden production decline. Without the flow rates necessary to maintain turbine function, output dropped by more than 60% within days of the shutdown. For grid operators already managing high summer loads, The reduction in renewable generation came at the worst possible moment. Rolling blackouts began to affect fringe neighborhoods in Phoenix and Las Vegas, and the strain on gas-fired backup generators increased sharply. Transportation infrastructure also felt the ripple effects. The Colorado River supports vital barge traffic in its lower reaches, particularly for moving construction materials, oil, and agricultural products between southwestern cities. With water levels dropping rapidly and river sections closed for geotechnical investigation, shipping routes were suspended indefinitely. Commercial operators were left in limbo, with some cargo stuck at river ports waiting for clearance. The economic implications of these delays began to mount almost immediately, further pressuring federal authorities to provide a timeline for resolution. Ecologically, the shutdown raised alarms from conservation groups. The Colorado River Delta, already starved from decades of upstream diversion, was poised for further degradation. Native fish species, some of which rely on continuous water flow to migrate and spawn, faced existential threats. Wetlands that depend on the river's seasonal floods for rejuvenation were at risk of drying completely. Agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and environmental NGOs deployed emergency response teams to assess damage and attempt to relocate vulnerable wildlife populations. Despite the crisis unfolding above ground, it was the mystery beneath the riverbed that commanded the greatest attention from geologists and federal scientists. The nature of the cracks defied conventional expectations. Satellite interferometry revealed that some segments of the riverbed had experienced vertical displacement, subtle shifts in elevation that hinted at active ground movement below the surface. There was speculation that deep aquifer depletion or geothermal pressure buildup might be contributing to the phenomenon, but conclusive evidence remained elusive. Advanced drilling rigs were brought in to sample rock layers deep beneath the river. Each core extracted revealed increasingly fractured and pressurized strata, suggesting a complex geological environment far more dynamic than previously understood. If this area of the riverbed had indeed become geologically unstable, it could signal a need to reevaluate long-term engineering assumptions that underpin water infrastructure across the region. The dam structures themselves came under immediate scrutiny. While there was no evidence of imminent failure, engineers feared that if the cracks extended toward or beneath dam foundations, even a minor shift could have catastrophic consequences. Structural integrity tests began at both Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam. Emergency reinforcements were considered, including the possibility of grouting fractures with high-density concrete. But such measures are not quick fixes. They require months, if not years, of planning and execution. Public anxiety surged in response to the rapid developments. The suddenness of the shutdown and the scale of its implications triggered a storm of media coverage and speculation. Water security, once an abstract concern for many urban dwellers, became an urgent reality. Town halls, online forums, and call-in shows buzzed with questions. Would water prices soar? Would food supply chains be disrupted? Could the dams actually fail? In many communities, these concerns bordered on panic. At the federal level, the situation became a top-tier priority. The president convened an emergency task force composed of the Secretaries of Interior, Energy, Agriculture, and Homeland Security. Regular briefings were held to evaluate the evolving science, monitor water consumption levels, and coordinate resource deployment. The National Guard was placed on standby in multiple states to assist with water distribution or evacuation support should the situation deteriorate further. The shutdown also reignited long-simmering tensions between states over water rights. The Colorado River Compact, signed over a century ago, has long been a source of legal and political conflict. With the river now closed indefinitely, questions about equitable access and emergency allocations surged to the forefront. Colorado and Utah pressed their case to retain more water upstream for domestic use and emergency reserves. California, with its sprawling agricultural empire and massive urban centers, demanded priority access to what little water could still be diverted. Arizona, caught in the middle, struggled to balance needs between its fast-growing cities and vulnerable farming communities. This fragmentation exposed the deep fragility of the Southwest's water management system. Built on assumptions of hydrological stability, the system was not designed to accommodate sudden and severe geological disruption. The Colorado River, long a symbol of human conquest over nature in the arid West, had now reminded the nation that its course and its condition cannot be taken for granted. International observers also took notice. Mexico, which receives a share of Colorado River water under a 1944 treaty, demanded immediate consultation and information. With water deliveries now suspended, regions of Baja California and Sonora that depend on the river for agriculture and urban supply faced critical shortages. Diplomats urged the U.S. to offer alternative arrangements, but none were forthcoming. The cracks in the riverbed, both literal and metaphorical, had opened a fault line in international cooperation. The scientific community, meanwhile, found itself at the center of an urgent and unprecedented investigation. Universities across the nation dispatched experts in hydrology, geology, and civil engineering to collaborate with federal teams. A surge of funding was directed toward research into subterranean dynamics, seismic risk modeling, and real-time monitoring technologies. There was a growing consensus that this event might represent more than just a local anomaly. It could be a signal of broader changes occurring within the Earth's crust beneath the American West. Even as the technical work advanced, the human drama continued to unfold. Indigenous communities along the river, many of whom have relied on its waters for centuries, were among the hardest hit. On the Navajo Nation, water deliveries were curtailed, and isolated communities began rationing. Tribal leaders called for federal assistance and urged greater inclusion in emergency planning and response efforts. Their pleas underscored a broader truth. The vulnerability to environmental disruption often falls most heavily on those with the least infrastructure to adapt. All across the Southwest, daily life was being reshaped by the absence of a river that had always been present. Parks closed, pools emptied, fountains ran dry. In some neighborhoods, tanker trucks became the new symbol of continuity, distributing precious water where pipes no longer flowed. At farms, rows of crops were left unwatered in a grim calculus of economic survival. In city centers, civic leaders convened urgent meetings on water recycling, desalination, and accelerated conservation measures. And everywhere, a collective question lingered in the air. How could a river as mighty as the Colorado become so vulnerable so quickly? There was no single answer, only a convergence of warning signs that had gone unheeded for too long. Decades of overuse, climate-driven drought, outdated infrastructure, and now, a sudden geological surprise had all converged to bring the river system to its knees. The cracks in the riverbed were not just physical breaks in stone. They were the visible fractures in a broader system pushed past its limits. As experts scrambled to assess, explain, and respond, the silence of the Colorado River grew louder with each passing day. No boats moved, no turbines turned, no water flowed from its once bountiful channels. The American West, so long shaped by the steady movement of this ancient river, was suddenly standing still, waiting for answers, for solutions, and for the water to return. While the initial shock of the shutdown rippled outward, behind the scenes, an even more intricate drama was unfolding in labs, control centers, and field command posts scattered across the western United States. The abrupt loss of control over the Colorado River system had flung open a Pandora's box of engineering and environmental uncertainties. From dam stress assessments to pressure modeling within the fractured riverbed, every hour brought new data and new questions. The sense of urgency was not just about restoring water flow, but about grasping the fundamental changes unfolding beneath one of the most manipulated river systems in the world. What alarmed many officials was how little precedent existed for handling a geological crisis of this kind in a riverbed so critical to national infrastructure. Unlike surface flooding, levee breaches, or even drought, which come with historical patterns and familiar response protocols, the emergence of tectonic fractures under a major river was essentially uncharted territory. The Bureau of Reclamation, typically focused on water allocation and dam maintenance, suddenly found itself dependent on geophysicists and deep earth imaging specialists to guide decisions that could affect millions of lives. To tackle the unknowns, an impromptu network of seismic monitoring equipment was deployed along the river's upper and lower basins. These high-sensitivity instruments, capable of detecting sub-millimeter ground movements, were vital in painting a real-time picture of how the earth beneath the Colorado was behaving. Data fed back into federal servers showed minor but consistent displacements across a 300-mile stretch of river corridor. enough to raise serious concerns about deeper crustal shifts. The emerging theory was that regional tectonic tension, possibly building unnoticed for decades, was finally finding release through the weakened channel of the riverbed, long carved into soft sediment and fractured rock. The deeper implications of this were sobering. If the Colorado River was, in effect, being pulled apart by subterranean forces, then its traditional flow path might be less stable than previously assumed. There were quiet discussions among scientists about the possibility of the river rerouting itself through newly formed channels, something that hadn't occurred in modern history but had precedent in ancient river systems across the world. The possibility that the river's course could shift, even slightly, posed extraordinary risks to infrastructure built on the assumption of permanence. Diversion tunnels, intake valves, bridges, and water treatment plants could all be rendered obsolete. Meanwhile, reservoirs upstream began to fill dangerously as inflow from snowmelt and tributaries continued despite the stoppage downstream. Lake Powell, in particular, teetered on the edge of overflow. Crews worked around the clock to manage emergency spillways, but with outflow throttled to a trickle due to instability beneath Glen Canyon Dam, water levels began to rise at a pace that left little margin for error. A dam designed to handle hydrological threats was now contending with a geological one. The paradox was devastating. Too much water at one end of the system and too little at the other. Downstream, riverbanks that had been submerged for decades began to re-emerge, revealing layers of sediment and debris long forgotten. Old growth stumps, relics of flooded forests, now jutted from the cracked mud. Entire ecosystems were caught in limbo, as amphibians, birds, and aquatic life that had synchronized their life cycles with the rhythmic pulses of river flow found themselves stranded. Insects hatched only to find dry air where there should have been water. Fish congregated in shrinking pools, increasingly vulnerable to heat and predators. Even the very air seemed to change. With vast stretches of the river drying under the sun, particulates from exposed silt began to blow into nearby communities. Air quality monitors in towns like Bullhead City and Blythe began registering spikes in fine dust levels, particularly PM2, 5 and PM10, posing respiratory risk to children and the elderly. What began as a water issue was now turning into a public health concern. Emergency advisories warned residents to stay indoors and wear filtration masks outdoors, especially during peak wind hours. In Washington, congressional leaders were racing to pass emergency legislation. Hearings were held under intense political pressure, with governors, mayors, tribal leaders, and agricultural lobbies all demanding resources, answers, and representation in decision-making. The emergency status of the river had brought long-standing tensions over Western water law into sharp relief. Some lawmakers advocated for federal override of state allocations in order to prioritize critical needs like drinking water and hospital supply. Others pushed for massive funding to expedite alternative water infrastructure, including desalination plants, inter-basin pipelines, and deep aquifer tapping. For private industry, the shutdown delivered a brutal lesson in the fragility of resource dependency. Semiconductor factories in Arizona that required ultra-pure water for chip production reported major slowdowns. Food processing plants in California's Central Valley laid off workers amid forecasts of reduced output. Even data centers, increasingly reliant on water for cooling, found themselves re-evaluating location strategy. For years, tech companies had flocked to the dry Southwest for its cheap land and minimal weather risks. Now they faced the reality that water, once abundant and taken for granted, had become a high-stakes liability. Insurance companies, always attuned to systemic risk, responded with swift recalculations. Water infrastructure, especially facilities located near the faulted river sections, was reclassified for higher risk underwriting. Premiums for commercial agricultural policies surged, and new clauses excluding geological disruption events began appearing in municipal and industrial coverage. Bond markets took notice too, with several water district credit ratings placed under review. For investors, the revelation that physical geography could alter the financial reliability of entire regions prompted a cascade of reassessments. In classrooms across the country, teachers found themselves fielding unexpected questions from students seeing headlines and hearing worried conversations at home. Lesson plans were hastily updated to include discussions about watersheds, tectonics, climate resilience, and the intersection of natural science with human infrastructure. The crisis served as a living case study for a generation growing up under the shadow of environmental uncertainty. For many young people, it was their first direct encounter with the limits of modern civilization's control over nature. On military bases throughout the Southwest, logistics teams re-evaluated base operations in light of potential water restrictions. Installations like Luke Air Force Base in Arizona and Nellis in Nevada depended in part on Colorado River supplies for daily operations, cooling systems, and fire suppression infrastructure. Though the Department of Defense maintained contingency water stores, prolonged disruption could begin to impact training schedules, readiness cycles, and maintenance. Coordination between the Pentagon and civilian agencies became part of the broader emergency strategy. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Colorado shutting down? Will the riverbed collapse? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.